A rabbit needs roughly 3 pounds of feed to gain 1 pound of body weight. A chicken can do it with about 2. So that sounds like the whole answer, right? Chicken is more efficient. Chicken wins. End of story. Except, not really. Because for a while, the United States actually wanted people to eat more rabbit. Not as some weird luxury food, not as a survival challenge, just normal dinner. The government promoted it. Magazines printed recipes for it. Families raised rabbits in their backyards for meat. And on paper, it made a lot of sense. Rabbits grow fast. They reproduce like crazy. Their meat is lean, high in protein, and they can eat things chickens can't really turn into meat very well. So here's the real question. If rabbit meat had so many advantages, why did chicken become one of the biggest meat industries on Earth, while rabbit stayed something you might see at a specialty butcher, a small farm, or maybe on a restaurant menu once in your life? The answer is way more interesting than feed math. Because rabbit didn't just lose to chicken. Rabbit lost to culture, cartoons, factories, grocery stores, fast food, and about 70 years of infrastructure. Let's start with the basic numbers. Chickens are unbelievably efficient animals. A modern broiler chicken can turn close to 2 pounds of feed into 1 pound of live weight. That's one of the big reasons chicken became so cheap and so common. If you're trying to build a meat industry, that matters a lot. Less feed means lower cost. Lower cost means cheaper meat. Cheaper meat means more people buy it. And once more people buy it, companies can scale up even more. That's the machine chicken built. Rabbits are different. A rabbit usually needs closer to 3 pounds of feed to gain a pound of weight. So if you only look at that number, rabbit looks worse. But that number hides something important. A chicken usually needs grain-heavy feed, corn, soy, things humans also grow, trade, ship, and price like commodities. A rabbit can live on rougher food, grass, hay, weeds, garden scraps, leafy leftovers, stuff that might otherwise just rot or get thrown away. So yes, a rabbit may be less efficient on paper, but depending on what you're feeding it, it can still be cheap to raise. That's why backyard farmers have liked rabbits for generations. You don't need a giant feed supply chain. You don't need acres of corn. You can raise rabbits in a small space with basic feed and turn things humans don't eat into meat. And nutritionally, rabbit looks pretty impressive too. Rabbit meat is very lean. It's high in protein. It's lower in fat than a lot of common meats. And people who eat it usually describe the taste as mild, clean, and somewhere between chicken and pork. Basically, it's exactly the kind of meat you'd expect health influencers to suddenly discover and start calling a superfood. Lean protein, low fat, clean taste. Small environmental footprint if raised the right way. It checks a lot of boxes. And then there's reproduction. Rabbits don't just grow quickly, they multiply fast. A single female rabbit can have several litters a year, and each litter can have multiple babies. That means one breeding rabbit can produce a surprising amount of meat over time. So at this point, rabbit sounds like it should have had a real shot. It grows fast. It breeds fast. It eats cheap roughage. It produces lean meat. And Americans actually have eaten it before. So what happened? The first big clue is World War II. During the war, beef and pork were rationed. Families had to stretch food. The government wanted people to produce more of their own meals at home. That's where rabbit came in. People were encouraged to raise rabbits in backyard hutches, almost like a meat version of a victory garden. You grew vegetables in the garden, and you raised rabbits behind the house. It was practical. Rabbits didn't need much space. They were quiet. They reproduced quickly, and they could provide protein at a time when meat was limited. For a few years, rabbit meat had momentum. It wasn't strange. It wasn't shocking. It was useful. But then the war ended, and once meat rationing disappeared, rabbit had to compete in normal American life. That's where things got complicated. Because at almost the exact same time, rabbits were becoming something else in American culture. They weren't just livestock anymore. They were becoming characters. Cute characters. Bugs Bunny, Thumper, the Velveteen Rabbit, Easter bunnies, children's books, cartoons, plush toys. For millions of kids, rabbits became soft, clever, innocent animals. They became pets. They became symbols of childhood. And that is a terrible starting point if you're trying to sell them as dinner. Think about it. Chicken never had that problem. Nobody looked at a pack of chicken breast and thought, wait, I watched this animal outsmart a hunter every Saturday morning. Chickens were already seen as farm animals. They were eggs. They were Sunday dinner. They were livestock. But rabbits were moving in the opposite direction. They were becoming companions. And once an animal becomes emotionally coded as cute, innocent, and pet-like, it becomes much harder to put it in the meat case. That doesn't mean nobody will eat it. Plenty of cultures still do. But in the U.S., the emotional hurdle got high. Really high. Rabbit didn't have a taste problem. It didn't have a nutrition problem. It had a branding problem. And that branding problem came at the worst possible time. Because while rabbits were becoming cute, chickens were becoming industrial. This is the part that really decides the story. In the mid-1900s, chicken farming changed completely. Companies started building vertically integrated systems. That means the same company could control almost everything: the breeding, the eggs, the chicks, the feed, the farms, the slaughterhouses, the packaging, the distribution. Instead of thousands of disconnected farmers all doing things their own way, chicken became a coordinated system, a machine. And once chicken became a machine, prices dropped. Birds could be bred to grow faster. Feed could be optimized. Processing plants could be designed around one type of animal, one body shape, one predictable growth schedule. That last part is huge. Easy to standardize. You can hatch thousands of chicks at once. You can feed them the same way. You can predict when they'll reach market weight. You can design equipment that handles millions of similar birds. That is gold for an industry. Factories love predictability. Grocery stores love consistency. Fast food chains love uniform portions. Chicken gave them all of that. Rabbit never did at the same scale. Rabbit farming stayed smaller, more regional, and more manual. There weren't massive rabbit slaughterhouses processing thousands of animals an hour. There weren't huge national systems making rabbit cheap everywhere. There wasn't a rabbit version of the chicken nugget that turned the animal into a $5 meal. And because demand stayed low, nobody wanted to invest the money to build that system. That created a brutal loop. Rabbit meat was uncommon, so processing stayed small. Processing stayed small, so rabbit meat stayed expensive. Rabbit meat stayed expensive, so most people didn't buy it. And because most people didn't buy it, companies had no reason to build bigger rabbit operations. Round and round it went. Chicken had the opposite loop. More infrastructure made chicken cheaper. Cheaper chicken created more demand. More demand justified more infrastructure. And eventually, chicken became everywhere. Grocery stores, school lunches, fast food, frozen dinners, barbecues, diet meals, gym bro meal prep. Chicken became the default protein because it was cheap, familiar, and easy to cook. That's the thing about food industries. The best animal doesn't always win. The animal that wins is the one that can become boring. And I mean that in the best way. Chicken became so normal that people stopped thinking about it. You don't stand in the grocery store having a moral debate with a chicken breast. You just buy it. That kind of familiarity is incredibly powerful. Rabbit never reached that point in America. For a lot of people, rabbit meat still feels like something you have to explain. You don't just serve it casually and expect zero reaction. Someone at the table is probably going to say, "Wait, rabbit?" And that one little pause matters. Because mass-market foods don't like hesitation. They like automatic buying. Chicken gets automatic buying. Rabbit gets questions. There's also a processing issue that sounds small, but probably matters more than people admit. Rabbits are quiet, soft-looking, expressive, pet-like. A lot of small farmers will tell you they're harder to process emotionally than chickens. Not physically impossible, just psychologically different. A chicken feels like livestock to most people. A rabbit feels closer to a pet. And when you're trying to build a large meat industry, that emotional friction becomes a real problem. Not just for customers, for workers too. If an animal is harder for people to emotionally separate from, that affects how easily it scales. Again, this doesn't mean rabbit farming can't exist. It does exist. It works in many places. But it helps explain why it never became the American default. And here's the bigger point. Chicken's dominance was never just about being more feed efficient. That helped, obviously, but the real advantage was that chicken fit perfectly into industrial America. It could be standardized. It could be processed quickly. It could be sold cheaply. It could be turned into nuggets, sandwiches, tenders, wings, frozen meals, and diet food. It worked for farms. It worked for factories. It worked for restaurants. It worked for grocery stores. And it worked for customers who wanted cheap protein without thinking too hard about where it came from. Rabbit had some amazing advantages, but it didn't fit the system as cleanly. It had the wrong cultural timing. It had weaker demand. It lacked national infrastructure. It was harder to standardize. And it carried emotional baggage chicken never had. That's why the question, why don't we eat more rabbit, has such a strange answer. It's not because rabbit tastes bad. It's not because rabbit is unhealthy. It's not even because rabbit makes no economic sense. In the right setting, it makes plenty of sense, especially on small farms, homesteads, or places where forage and scraps are available. But replacing chicken? That's a completely different challenge. Because chicken is not just an animal anymore. Chicken is a system. It's hatcheries, feed mills, contracts, trucks, processing plants, inspectors, freezers, restaurants, recipes, habits, and decades of consumer trust. Rabbit would have to compete with all of that, not just with the bird. And that's almost impossible once the system is already built. In countries like France, Italy, and parts of China, rabbit never became as strange as it did in the United States. It stayed part of the food culture. People didn't have the same level of cartoon baggage around it. So clearly, the animal was never the real problem. The context was. The timing was. America had a moment when rabbit meat could have become normal. World War II gave it a push. Backyard farmers knew it worked. The nutrition was there. The practicality was there. But then the war ended. The cartoons arrived. Chicken industrialized. Fast food exploded. And rabbit missed its window. By the time anyone looked back and said, "Wait, why don't we eat more rabbit?" Chicken had already taken over the entire meat aisle. So no, rabbit didn't lose only because it needs more feed. It lost because chicken got 70 years of factories, supply chains, marketing, and habit behind it. Rabbit had lean meat. Chicken had an empire. And in the food business, that makes all the difference. So maybe the real question isn't, why don't we eat rabbit? Maybe it's this. What would it take for any animal to compete with chicken now? Because once a food becomes cheap, familiar, and everywhere, it stops being just food. It becomes normal. And normal is very hard to beat.